Hello, welcome to New England Authors. It's so good to have you on a show with us. We explore different subjects every time. Our guest today is Askold Melnyczuk. Welcome to the show, Askold.
Thanks, Kameel.
Askold is a professor of English at UMass Boston, and he's written several books, including notable books by the New York Times. You chair the MFA Department and teach creative writing. So let's start with the beginning. What is creative writing? How is it different than fiction writing?
It includes fiction writing, but it also includes poetry and memoir. Simple as that.
It's all kinds of writing.
Yeah, what it isn't is scholarly writing. So it's actually the creative writing program, which is and offers an MFA, which is a terminal degree, kind of comparable to a PhD, but focused in writing. And it's more like a conservatory or an art school rather than an academic environment. Though of course there are academic courses that our students take.
So more kind of literary fiction.
Literary fiction, yep.
Okay.
Whatever that is.
No, whatever that means. And whatever poetry means, by the way.
It's
a
true
very
too.
difficult
That's true
thing
too.
to define.
It is,
and
absolutely.
You happen to have a couple of, you have poets in, I don't know,
few of the novels,
all your
yes,
books,
right.
But
a few of the novels. They do surface here and there. Yep, that's right.
So your writing is so diverse, it's really hard to know where to start. So I just want to start with this one here, which is called Smedley's Secret Guide to World Literature. And it's your latest, right?
That's right.
Okay, now it's told by a 15-year-old boy. He's the son of like a dysfunctional family. Would you say that's right?
It's a family that's on the falling apart. That's right.
Falling apart, yes.
Yeah.
And his father happens to be a poet.
His father happens to be a poet.
Not that poets are necessarily.
No, it just so happens.
It just so happens.
That's right.
Now he's your typical irresponsible 15-year-old, right?
He's irresponsible by the standards of your typical 50-year-old. For a 15-year-old, he may be the perfect 15-year-old. The issue is point of view here.
Yes. So I was just astounded how you got into this mind of him, because it's very clear that I really felt the 15-year-old coming through. He's really irresponsible. He does something with a friend of his that gets him kicked out of school. We don't exactly know what it is at the beginning. We find out later on.
That's right. I don't want to spoil the surprise.
No, it won't spoil the surprise. But you almost say it in the beginning. And then he gets his 15-year-old, 14-year-ld girlfriend pregnant, right?
There's some possibility
no
of that.
responsibility for that.
He
Avoids
flees it.
telephone calls. Yes. And then what he's supposed to be looking after his godfather,
who's had a stroke.
and he's in a
New York
wheelchair.
City. In New York
and
City.
what does he do? Instead of looking after him, he runs away to find
He falls in love with a young woman who's coming around to help his godfather. That's right.
Totally responsible. How hard was it? Did you base this on a particular person, when you were 15?
I hope not. No, Mom, I never did this. It was. I was surprised and perhaps a little disturbed at how easy it was to lapse back into a 15-year-old state of mind, to be a randy 15-year-old, but I suppose that all of us carry that around in us. At the same time, I was writing the book at a particularly difficult time in my life. My mother was very sick. I was doing a lot of elder care, and the stress of that was kind of getting to me. And I was actually sitting in the Cambridge Public Library poring over a volume by a 17th century biographer, Aubrey's Brief Lives. It's a sort of well-known series of cameo biographies of celebrated 16th century figures, including a number of literary figures. And I'd opened the book to a particular biography of a poet, Richard Lovelace, whose poetry I happen to love.
Yes.
I mean, he's the guy who wrote Stone Walls Do Not a Prison Make, nor Iron Bars a Cage. Yeah, so you know that poem. Everybody knows that poem. I learned that in high school. And the biographer was kind of writing about him with this great kind of passion and enthusiasm. And I was wondering what there was kind of around the edges of that relationship between him and his subject. And then suddenly, like, this voice began to make wisecracks about these two men and their relationship. And it was, each of my books begins with kind of a voice coming to the surface, sort of a character saying something. And it's not really my voice, it's somebody else's voice. And what this kid said kind of cracked me up. And because the rest of life seemed so heavy and demanding at the time, I was kind of happy to tune into that voice and follow it where it wanted to go. And where it wanted to go was out of Cambridge and to New York City.
And so his father, his poet father, gives him an assignment. So he gets suspended from school because of a kind of cruel and disturbing prank. Right.
And his father tells him to write a history of literature in the age of Twitter. And so he says, okay, Dad, you're a poet, you're so smug and in your professorship, I'm going to show you what I can do with this subject. And so he approaches it with a kind of brio that surprises him himself. He grabs a bunch of books off his father's bookshelf, some randomly, some by design, grabs, stuffs them into his bag, grabs his iPad, and then heads off to New York to also take care of his godfather, who's just had a stroke and is confined to a wheelchair.
Yeah.
That sets him off.
And this gives you the excuse to talk about some of these great writers, especially Agnes Smedley.
Yes.
Who was, you want to talk about her a little bit?
Well, Agnes Smedley was a remarkable character who came from, hard-scrabble poverty. Her brother died young, working, doing kind of road work, digging ditches. She was a very talented, smart kid who began to teach school and then decided that the sort of rural life was not for her, and she kind of took off to New York. And in New York, she became a journalist. She became very involved in women's rights with Margaret Sanger and with women's reproductive rights issues. And she actually went on to have an astonishing career. She traveled all over the world. She actually met Mao Zedong, taught him how to dance. And when she said something offensive to Mao, Madame Mao slapped her. She slapped her right back. I mean, she was a really nervy character. But her life was tragic. She wound up kind of coming back to the States later on and was put up at a very well-known literary colony, the Yaddo kind of colony, where she was trying to get some work done. At that point, one of Boston's own, the kind of great poet Robert Lowell, decided that Agnes Smedley had been a communist sympathizer and she needed to be outed. And so Smedley got kicked out of her residency at Yaddo. And
she was a communist sympathizer.
Yes, she was indeed. She was indeed. Yeah, absolutely. This wasn't a lie, but it was also no cause for, it was a reflection of the kind of hysteria of the times that that sent her scurrying out and into desperate poverty. She died indigent in London, and I believe was buried in a pauper's grave. So it was, the book did give me an occasion to explore all kinds of interesting, varied literary lives that have been forgotten.
Yeah, you mentioned so the kid goes off to New York, and he examines some of the besides being irresponsible, he examines some of these people's lives. And the book, like Grazia de Leda.
Yes, Grazia Montesani de Leda.
Yeah, she was
a Sardinian.
One of my
really?
Sardinian, one of my favorite writers.
Seriously, how is that possible? Where did you read her? How did you come upon her?
Oh, gee, she talks about daily life in Sardinia.
That's right, very hard-scrabble life.
In the 1920s
That's
and
right.
so on. It was not, life was not easy.
No, she and Agnes Smedley had that in common. They really kind of grew up in rural poverty, and De Leda stayed with that for a long time before moving to Rome.
Yeah. By the way, this is New England Authors. We're talking with Askold Melnyczuk. The other book that I read was What Is Told. Now, the book is very different. So this one, the one we're talking about, the 15-year-old, it's written in the first person from his point of view.
That's right.
The other one, what really struck me about this What Is Told is the voice. Now, it takes place in Ukraine, right?
Well, it begins in Ukraine, and
yeah.
then it also moves to
New Jersey.
New Jersey.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, tell us a little about it. So there's a protagonist couple who marry the day the Archduke
That's
Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo.
That's right. At the start of the World War I, and they're kind of a odd couple for the time because the husband is actually quite progressive and believes in women's rights. And actually, the first chapter of the novel is titled "Woman is the Future," and he really tries to encourage his wife to develop her talents and her skills. And then, as war overtakes the region, he and his growing family are forced to emigrate. They get caught up in the struggles of World War II and the way they played out in Ukraine, which was particularly harsh as it was a country divided between the Nazis and the communists. And he and his family wind up spending 5 years in this displaced persons camp before getting an invitation to come to the States.
So you're Ukrainian, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. So this is
Ukrainian American.
Ukrainian American. Okay. Second generation, right?
Yeah, I always get that confused. Am I first? Am I second? Because I guess second, right?
Yes.
I was born here.
Yes. What was the Ukraine? I mean, you paint a very harsh picture of it. Life was kind of hard there, especially during the wars and so on. And they went from one rule to another rule to another rule. Tell us a little about the history there.
Sure. Well, and again, it's a country that was occupied for some 600 years, from about the middle of the 14th century until it regained its independence, finally, only in 1990. And as you may know, occupation by a foreign power is never an easy thing. So the kind of locals, the native peoples, had to struggle to maintain their identity against kind of great odds, and they found all kinds of ingenious ways of doing it, to maintain a culture and a language while being pressed on all sides, sometimes by the Austro-Hungarians, sometimes by their Polish neighbors, sometimes by their Lithuanian neighbors, sometimes by the Russians, sometimes by the Germans, to submit.
Yeah.
So kind of a lot of the culture went underground for a long time. The 20th century was an especially harsh time for the country. After the First World War, there was Stalin was in power in Moscow, and you had a famine, an engineered famine that killed somewhere between 4 and 7 million people, and that there was nobody who in the country who remained untouched by it in some way.
Yeah.
So it was
Four,
tough times.
to 7 million out of a population of what, do you think?
Well, at that time, I think it was probably 30 to 40 million, or probably even less than that, 25.
Yeah,
Actually, again, I don't have the stats at my fingertips. We'd have to Google that. I'm sure somebody will.
Well, it was very fascinating to read the book, but what I really liked was the voice you use, and I guess this comes from being a creative writing person.
No, I hope it just comes from writing. And always, and we all have many voices.
So, and I was trying to find the adjective for the voice, and to describe it. Is it brisk? Is it there's a kind of slight buffoon aspect to it? Was it
Well, there are two approaches to tragic experiences. What is it? Heraclitus cried and Democritus laughed, or was it the reverse? I've forgotten.
I've forgotten that one.
And laughter is certainly one of the ways in which you can come to terms and survive and endure a difficult experience. I mean, you're pointing out something I'd not really thought of, but that is a connection, say, between my first novel and my most recent one, What Is Told, and Smedley's Secret Guide to World Literature, in that in both cases there are hard things going on, and in both cases it is a kind of slightly comic, slightly ironic voice that helps the characters cope with what they can't avoid.
Yeah. How did you come up with that voice?
Voice is a funny thing, and
we're talking about the kind of narrative
Yeah,
voice.
the narrative voice. Well,
and
right, because as you said, in Smedley, it's the first person, so it's like the 15-year-old voice, and it's a wisecracking voice, and it's a voice we all all probably had when we were 15-year-old kids. And the other one is a omniscient narrator, so it's writing from the outside, but it is a narrator that is trying to let the reader accept and embrace and directly feel the harsh experiences that the characters are going through. If I had written that in a kind of somber and tragic voice, which is what in some ways the events demand, I think it would have been really hard to take for readers. And you know, voices also are determined by the material, and they kind of come from the process, the act of writing itself. It's not something that you decide, or at least in my case, that I decide in advance that I'm going to write in that voice. Smedley, a voice kind of surfaced and spoke to me. In this case, the voice was, I think, the best way to shape all the different kinds of incidents that that the book encompasses.
So, like, does character come first, or does the setting of the Ukraine, or the it all comes together? What?
This book kind of came together, began very strangely when I wrote the first 60 pages or so in about 3 or 4 days, and the material sort of seemed to burst forth, and it dictated itself, at least to start. The last 200 pages took about 10 years, so I paid the price for that early kind of first.
So this book's been brewing for 10 years.
This book it took a long time to get there. But you know, one of the reasons also was because of the peculiar sort of place of Ukraine in the kind of international narrative.
Exactly, even today,
Today it's very different because it, after all, does have its own independence. But when I was writing the book in the 80s and into the 90s, it came out in 1994, Ukraine really didn't exist. It was part of the Soviet Union. When I was growing up and going to school in New Jersey, teachers would ask, where was your family from? And I'd say, from Ukraine. They'd say, oh, that's Russia. And I'd say, no, not really. And you know, for a 10-year-old to be talking back to his teachers and explaining the history to them is kind of a tricky proposition. But that kind of continued all the way into my college years and graduate school, where the place that my parents came from didn't exist in the minds of almost anybody else, any of my peers. And you know, it was really interesting because it was actually, so for a while I did not try, in fact, you know, the first things I wrote were really inspired by the work of two very American writers, John Cheever and John O'Hara, both of whom John Cheever wrote about.
Great writers.
Great writers,
you know,
great writers.
Wonderful writers.
Absolutely, and you got to learn from the best.
Yeah.
But their subject matter happened to be a kind of WASP, New England and New York in the case of Cheever, and O'Hara also. And you know, I took that as my subject matter. So I tried to write about executives in New York, you know, while growing up as a working class kid, child of refugees in New Jersey. And it took me a while to be able to feel that the material that was mine was worth fiction, that it could be written about. So for years I wrote stories that took place in a kind of no man's land with characters that had no names and no histories. And it was in a lot of ways the poet, the St. Lucian poet Derek Walcott, who encouraged me to believe that the particular nouns that I had inherited really had a place in the literary world. Yeah. And you know, I always think, you asked about creative writing, teaching and programs and stuff, and I always think of a line by the poet Richard Hugo, who said, creative writing classes are the last place where our life matters. You know, it's a place where you give away a number and take back your name. And this book happened to be the first sort of commercially published novel that took on the Ukrainian theme. And there hadn't been a language or a precedent for it for me. So, you know, it's maybe one of the reasons it took 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I now that you mentioned Cheever and O'Hara, I really see a very similar use of voice there.
Well, I take that as a great compliment.
Yeah, okay. So let's go on to Ambassador of the Dead. And in this book, it's also about Ukraine. It starts off with somebody who's actually a doctor, who gets, shall we say, summoned by someone in an old woman, blind old woman in New York, saying you have to come. It's an emergency. She doesn't tell him what it is. We don't find out for quite a while, and then we're taken to backstories of Ukraine and New Jersey and all. Tell us a little about the book and how it originated.
Yeah, that's certainly my darkest book, and it's really about the underside of the refugee or immigrant experience. It's about those refugees who believed in the American dream and discovered that it was just a dream and somebody else's dream at that, and not something that they were themselves ever going to experience. And they were unable to come to terms with those realities. Certainly I saw plenty of that growing up. And with this novel, there was no sort of exuberant or funny voice that came up.
There was not. Yeah.
In fact, the first draft of this novel largely was in the voice of the main character, Ada Kruk, who herself experienced the famine in Ukraine, experienced World War II, and really never got over it. And the harshness of her early life reflected in the ways in which she managed to make it nearly impossible for her children to enter into the new world to which she had brought them. And that was sort of the theme that I wanted to look at. You know, what happens when nothing you expected or hoped to happen goes as planned? Who do you take it out on? Whose fault is it? Yeah, so that's part of the subject of the book. And then the other part, as you may know, was also the kind of the relationship between different ethnic groups in the old world.
So she experiences so much. She experiences the death of a family and being arrested by the secret police and so on.
Yep.
It's not easy telling. You know, it's difficult stories.
They were.
Yeah.
They were.
Going
I wish.
Well,
I wish it had been otherwise, but so was the reality.
You've written so many other books. You've written one called House of Mirrors, which I read. House of Windows. Widows. Which I read a long time ago when it came out. There was a book reading, and I bought your book at that time. But I wanted to turn. You edited this book, which I haven't seen, about the late Father Daniel Berrigan.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about him, especially for young people who might not know who he,
it's funny.
he was.
Yeah, Father Daniel Berrigan was one of the great figures of the 20th and early 21st century. He was a Jesuit priest and an anti-war activist. He and his brother, Philip Berrigan, were among the most important anti-war figures in the kind of certainly in the Catholic world, but I think throughout the nation, as exemplary resistors of the kind of pressures of empire. Dan and his brother were among the group of war resistors who broke into the draft office in Catonsville, Maryland, and poured blood over the draft records and were arrested for that. Dan subsequently wrote a very powerful play about that called The Trial of the Catonsville Nine, which I had the privilege of reading in my senior high school class under the auspices of a very progressive English teacher in a public school. And so that was my first kind of encounter with him. I later had the deep honor of getting to know Dan, and what you asked me to say something about him for the sake of a younger generation, and it was precisely for that reason that I discovered that my students did not know about him.
Right.
That I decided to pull together a book of essays about him. Many of them were written by students who, again, were coming across him for the first time. Dan was also really a wonderful poet. His first book of poetry was selected by no less a figure than Mary Ann Moore for the Lamont Poetry Prize, and he was equally committed to his poetry, which was place in which his heart could speak to the reader directly. Though, of course, in his poetry, he was never less than a living conscience.
Yeah, yeah, he was a great figure, and a great figure inspired so many other people. Do you see in your young students, do you see skilled writers coming up?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I've had fantastic students who have gone on to great success, including New York Times bestseller, Left Me Far in the Dust, and it's a pleasure to see, because it is you see the art continuing, you see a commitment to the art continuing. There's so much talk about the indifference to literature and books in this younger generation, and it's just really not what I am finding. There is, among a select group, a desire to use the medium as it's always been used, as a way to give the imagination free rein and allow us to discover the many selves that we carry within us, and communicate that to readers who are enlarged by that experience.
Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you,
I can't
Kameel.
believe that we've only scratched the surface of your work. Askold Melnyczuk, a good friend of mine, and an avid writer and teacher, and a credit to New England. This is New England Authors. Remember, watch locally. Thank you.
Thanks, Kameel.